The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood. The park was alive with the soft hum of summer, a perfect afternoon for families to unwind. Laughter echoed from the swings as children played, their voices carefree against the backdrop of rustling trees. Sarah sat on a wooden bench, her eyes following her daughter, Emily, who was gleefully chasing a red kite that fluttered wildly in the breeze. Emily's laughter rang out, light and innocent, as she darted around the park, her golden hair flying behind her like a halo. It was a simple, peaceful moment, the kind of afternoon every mother hoped for. Sarah smiled to herself, a quiet sense of contentment washing over her as she watched her daughter revel in the freedom of youth. A few feet away, Officer Harris stood at the edge of the playground, his watchful eyes scanning the scene. His canine partner, Max, a large German shepherd, sat obediently by his side, his head slightly tilted as he observed the children. Max was more than just a dog. He was a seasoned police canine, trained to detect threats, track down suspects, and protect those in danger. His sharp, brown eyes missed nothing, and he seemed to always be on alert, even in moments like this when the park was buzzing with normal, everyday life. But something was off. Max's ears twitched, his body tensing slightly, as though he sensed something out of place. Officer Harris noticed the subtle shift in the dog's behavior and instinctively glanced over his shoulder. The man had just appeared at the edge of the park, walking slowly, almost as if he was trying not to draw attention. He wasn't part of the usual crowd here. His dark jacket seemed too formal for a warm afternoon, and the way he looked around nervously made Officer Harris raise an eyebrow. The man's eyes swept over the children, lingering a little too long on the ones playing near the swings in the sandbox. At first, Officer Harris thought it was just his instincts kicking in, but as the man started moving toward the edge of the playground, something inside Harris clicked. Max was now growling low, the sound vibrating in his chest, a clear signal that the dog had picked up on something more than just an unfamiliar face. The man's steps were deliberate, but his eyes were shifting nervously from one child to the next. He was moving closer to where Emily was playing with the kite. Sarah, distracted for a moment as she took a sip of her iced tea, didn't notice, but Max did. A low bark broke the silence, and Officer Harris took a half step forward, instinctively reaching for the leash, his fingers tightening around it as Max's growl turned into a more menacing sound. The dog's body was now coiled, ready to act. Harris turned fully to face the man, his hand on his gun holster, though he had yet to pull it out. He was waiting for the man to make a move that would confirm what Max already knew. Something wasn't right. The man's footsteps quickened, and Officer Harris felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Max was no longer just growling. His hackles were raised, and his eyes were locked on the stranger with an intensity that Harris had seen only when the dog sensed real danger. Harris' instincts were screaming at him now. Something wasn't right, and he needed to act fast. Max's body shifted, preparing to lunge, but Harris held him back with a firm grip. His eyes never left the man, who was now moving with purpose, his pace growing more deliberate. The stranger's gaze flicked at Emily, and his expression darkened as he zeroed in on her. It was subtle, but Harris could see it. This man was not just a passerby. The park, once filled with the carefree sounds of children's laughter, suddenly felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. Harris stepped forward, his heart rate quickening as he assessed the situation in a split second. The man was too close to Emily, and he was moving with an unsettling calmness. Sarah, still unaware of the danger lurking, chatted with another parent a few yards away, her attention diverted. Emily, unaware of the stranger approaching, was still twirling with her kite, the wind tugging it in every direction. Max barked once, louder now, his voice piercing the air. Officer Harris didn't hesitate. "Stay," he commanded firmly, though his voice carried a sharp edge of urgency. Max, though clearly agitated, obeyed, sitting rigidly by his side, eyes still fixed on the man. Harris took a few slow steps forward, positioning himself between the stranger and the children. The man glanced up, meeting Harris's gaze for the briefest moment. There was something strange about the look, almost too calm, like he was sizing up the officer. His lips twitched into a half smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Before Harris could say anything, the man made his move. He lunged forward with alarming speed, grabbing Emily by the wrist as she tried to step away from him. The suddenness of the action caught Sarah's attention, and her head snapped around just in time to see the man hoisting Emily off the ground. "Mom!" Emily screamed, her small hands pushing against the man's chest, but he was too strong. Her legs kicked in a frantic attempt to break free. Harris's heart skipped a beat, adrenaline flooding his system. He had trained for situations like this, but there was no time to think. The man was moving fast, too fast, and Emily's terrified cries were like a call to action that Harris couldn't ignore. Max, sensing the danger, barked louder this time, his voice booming across the park. The sound was raw, filled with an urgency that sent a shiver down Harris's spine. Max wasn't just barking, he was ready to act. Without a second thought, Harris tugged the leash, releasing Max. The dog sprang into motion like a bullet, launching himself toward the man with the force of a freight train. The man, startled by the sudden movement, stumbled back, loosening his grip on Emily for just a moment. That brief hesitation was enough. Emily fell to the ground, landing hard but safely, and in the same instant, Max lunged for the man's arm, his jaws snapping dangerously close. The stranger cursed under his breath, pulling back in an attempt to shake the dog off, but Max's bite was firm. The dog wasn't letting go. "Let her go," Harris shouted, his voice commanding, his hand now resting on his gun holster. The situation had escalated from a simple park visit to a life-or-death confrontation in a matter of seconds. The man looked around frantically, realizing he was surrounded. The other parents were beginning to notice the commotion, but no one was close enough to intervene. His eyes darted from Emily to Officer Harris, calculating his next move, but Max had already thrown him off balance. The moment Emily hit the ground, her small body scrambling to regain her footing, Max lunged forward with incredible speed. His teeth clamped onto the man's arm with a sharp, piercing snap. The man yelped, his grip on Emily loosening just enough for the dog's attack to throw him off balance. Max's growl was guttural, fierce, as his paws dug into the ground, keeping the man in place. The German Shepherd's sharp instincts had kicked into overdrive. He wasn't just defending the child. He was ensuring that no harm would come to her. "Let her go," Officer Harris shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. But the man was too focused on trying to free himself from Max's grasp to listen. The dog's jaws were locked tight, unrelenting in their hold. The man staggered back, attempting to push Max off, but the dog wouldn't budge. His training was flawless. He wasn't just a pet. Max was a weapon when it came to protecting others. Emily scrambled to her knees, her face twisted in fear but relieved to be free from the stranger's grasp. Sarah, now fully aware of the danger, rushed over to her daughter, scooping her up into her arms and holding her close. Emily buried her face in her mother's shoulder, trembling uncontrollably. "Mom, I'm scared," Emily whispered, her voice shaky. Sarah whispered soothing words, trying to calm her daughter, but her own heart was racing. Her mind was still struggling to catch up with what had just happened. She looked back at the man, who was still trying to shake Max off, his face a mix of anger and frustration. Max growled again, tightening his grip, refusing to let go of the stranger. The man finally stopped struggling, realizing that fighting the dog was pointless. His breath came in ragged gasps, his face pale with the shock of having been bested by a dog. Officer Harris was already moving forward, his hand hovering over his gun. "Stay down," he barked at the man, his voice sharp and commanding. The man froze. His hands, still raised in a half-hearted attempt to defend himself, slowly lowered in resignation. The crowd around the park, which had been mostly oblivious to the situation moments ago, was now staring, some people pulling out their phones to record the scene. But no one dared approach. They were witnessing something they had only seen in movies, an actual kidnapping attempt thwarted by a dog and a quick-thinking officer. The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder, signaling that backup was on the way. Officer Harris nodded to Max, and the dog reluctantly released the man's arm, still barking in warning. The man took a step back, but he knew he was cornered. He had nowhere to go. Harris approached slowly, his hand still on his holster. His eyes never left the man, and neither did Max. "You're not going anywhere," Harris said coldly, his voice full of authority. The man's shoulders slumped, defeated. Nearby, Emily clung to her mother, tears still streaming down her face. She looked up at Max, her small hand reaching out toward the dog, who was now standing by Officer Harris's side. Despite the terror she had just experienced, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of gratitude toward the dog who had kept her safe. "Thank you, Max," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, but full of emotion. Max's ears perked up at the sound of his name, and he looked at her briefly before turning back to the man, his focus unwavering. It was clear that Max's job wasn't over yet, but for now the immediate danger was gone. Sarah squeezed Emily tighter, her mind still trying to process what had just happened. How close they had come to losing her daughter. And yet here they were, safe thanks to the quick action of a police dog and an officer who had acted without hesitation. The man, now standing still and defeated, slowly glanced around at the growing crowd of onlookers. His eyes flickered with panic, realizing that he was no longer in control of the situation. Max, though no longer physically restraining him, remained a constant, menacing presence by Officer Harris's side, ready to leap if the man made another move. Officer Harris had his gun drawn now, keeping a careful eye on the man's every movement. "Don't even think about it," Harris warned, his voice low and steady. But the man, his breathing shallow, wasn't listening. His hands trembled as he reached into his jacket pocket. "What are you doing?" Harris barked, his eyes narrowing. But the man didn't answer. Instead, he took another shaky step backward and reached for something hidden beneath his jacket. In the next instant, his entire demeanor shifted, like a switch had flipped. His posture straightened, and his eyes filled with a desperate resolve. Before Harris could react, the man turned on his heel and bolted. "Hey!" Harris shouted, but it was too late. The man sprinted toward a parked car, parked just at the edge of the park's entrance, near a small row of trees that offered enough cover for him to make a dash for it. Max barked again, this time with urgency, his body tense as he bounded toward the man's retreating figure. Officer Harris, knowing full well that he couldn't let the man get away, shouted again, "Max, stay!" The dog skidded to a halt, only narrowly avoiding a collision with a lamppost. Harris' eyes followed the man's movements as he neared the car. There was no time to wait for backup. "Stay," Harris repeated, but he was already sprinting after the man, his boots pounding against the pavement. The man reached the car, and in one fluid motion, he jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. Within seconds, the engine roared to life. Tires screeched as the man slammed the gas pedal, sending the car tearing out of the parking lot and into the street. Officer Harris was only a few steps behind him, but there was no way he could catch up on foot. Damn it! He cursed under his breath, pulling out his radio as he sprinted toward his patrol car. "This is Officer Harris. Suspect in a possible kidnapping attempt fleeing the scene, heading west on Oak Street. Requesting backup. Pursuit in progress." Max, having heard the order to stay, was still at the edge of the park, his eyes locked on the fleeing vehicle. His body tensed as if he, too, understood the gravity of the situation. He barked again, but Harris couldn't afford to waste any time. With a final glance toward Max, he dove into his patrol car, slamming the door shut behind him. The sirens wailed to life as Harris gunned the engine, peeling out of the park's entrance just in time to catch sight of the man's car swerving through traffic ahead of him. The chase had officially begun. Harris' hands were steady on the wheel as he maneuvered through the streets, trying to close the gap. The man's car was fast, faster than he expected, but Harris had the advantage of experience. And Max, still on the scene, had already given him an edge by stopping the man's plan to flee the moment he tried to grab Emily. Ahead, the man's car weaved dangerously in and out of lanes, cutting off unsuspecting drivers. Harris gritted his teeth and floored the gas pedal. "You're not getting away," he muttered under his breath. The adrenaline was pumping through his veins now. This was no longer a simple park incident. This was a high-speed chase, and he wasn't going to let the man escape without facing the consequences. Mac's barking echoed in Harris' mind as the pursuit gained speed. The man had made his choice, and now Harris would ensure he paid for it. The man's car shot through the streets, weaving through traffic like a bullet. His tires screeched as he cut sharp corners, narrowly avoiding collisions with other vehicles. The sound of the engine roaring filled the air as the car sped down Oak Street, the rush of wind almost deafening inside Officer Harris' patrol car. "Hold on," Harris muttered to himself, his eyes narrowed and his focus completely on the road ahead. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he pushed the car to its limits, trying to close the gap between himself and the fleeing suspect. The sirens wailed behind him, growing louder as more patrol cars joined the chase. But the man wasn't slowing down. His car was far faster than Harris's, and he seemed to have no regard for the other drivers on the road, swerving dangerously around vehicles, barely avoiding crashes. Each second that passed, Harris could feel the tension building. This wasn't just a simple chase anymore. It was a race against time. "Come on," Harris growled under his breath, his foot pressing harder on the gas pedal. His patrol car pushed forward, but the man's car was still ahead, taking every turn with reckless abandon. Harris glanced in his rearview mirror, seeing the flashing lights of more police cars behind him. It was a good thing he wasn't alone now. Backup had arrived, but there was still no sign of stopping. The man's desperate attempt to flee had become all-consuming. He was on a mission, and whatever it was, he wasn't going to let the police catch him without a fight. Harris tightened his grip on the wheel, turning sharply to follow the man as he made another tight corner onto Maple Avenue. The car swerved again, narrowly missing a pedestrian crossing the street. "Watch out," Harris shouted through gritted teeth, hoping that the pedestrian had gotten out of the way in time. The man's reckless driving only made Harris push harder. He couldn't afford to let the suspect get away. He had already seen what the man was willing to do to escape. It wasn't just a kidnapping attempt anymore. It was a fight for freedom, and Harris wasn't going to let that happen. Ahead, the man's car turned onto a narrower street, cutting through a residential area. The speed was insane, and Harris could hear the screeching of tires as the suspect drifted the car dangerously through a series of sharp turns. The scent of burnt rubber filled the air, mixing with the heavy rush of adrenaline in Harris' veins. But then, just as the man seemed to have the advantage, he made a fatal mistake. He cut too hard at a sharp bend, misjudging the curve. Harris' eyes widened in the moment of realization, and he hit the brakes just in time to avoid slamming into the back of the suspect's car. The man's car fishtailed, the rear end sliding out of control as it clipped the curve, sending it into a spin. Time seemed to slow as Harris watched the car barrel toward a row of parked vehicles. He knew it was now or never. With a sharp turn of the wheel, Harris accelerated and slid his patrol car into the right lane, putting him in perfect position. The man's car, still spinning, crashed into a dumpster and came to a violent halt against a nearby wall. The screech of metal on metal echoed as the man's car finally came to a stop. It was over. Harris slammed the brakes, bringing his own car to a screeching halt a few feet from the wreckage. The man was trapped. "Get out of the car! Now!" Harris shouted, his voice booming through the chaos. The man, dazed and disoriented from the crash, tried to unbuckle his seatbelt, but his hands were shaking uncontrollably. He hadn't expected to be cornered so quickly. Officer Harris jumped out of his car, his gun drawn and aimed at the man's vehicle. He was already moving toward the wreck, his heart pounding in his chest. But this time, there was no escape. The man was trapped, and he was going to pay for his crimes. Max, having followed from a distance in the police unit's vehicle, leaped out and stood next to Harris, his body tense and ready for action. With the man's escape attempt thwarted, the dog now stood poised, a silent reminder of just how close this had all come to being far worse. The suspect's car sat crumpled against the wall, steam rising from the engine, its tires shredded and smoking. The air was thick with the smell of burnt rubber, and the sounds of the crash still reverberated through the streets. Officer Harris' pulse was racing, but his focus never wavered as he approached the wrecked car. Max stood at his side, his powerful frame tense and ready for anything. The German shepherd's eyes were locked on the man's vehicle, his ears alert, watching for any signs of movement. Harris' hand tightened around the grip of his gun as he moved closer, his steps slow and calculated. "Get out of the car!" Harris shouted again, his voice commanding, cutting through the stillness of the neighborhood. The man was still inside, slumped in his seat, disoriented by the crash. His breathing was labored, and he seemed dazed, trying to steady himself. Harris didn't wait for a response. He reached the car and jerked open the door, the cold metal protesting with a sharp screech. The suspect, now fully aware of his situation, blinked up at Harris, his eyes wild with panic. His hands trembled as they reached for the door handle, but Harris was already on him. The man's face was bruised from the impact, but his eyes were filled with defiance. He knew he was cornered, but he still had the nerve to glare up at the officer, his lips curling into a tight sneer. Harris pulled him out of the car roughly, slamming him to the ground with a force that left the man gasping for breath. Max stood by, his eyes never leaving the suspect, ready to spring into action if the man tried anything. "Stay down," Harris growled, his voice low and authoritative as he handcuffed the man. The suspect struggled briefly, but it was clear that any fight had left him. The adrenaline that had once fueled his escape was now drained, replaced with the bitter realization that he had failed. "Who are you?" Harris demanded, crouching down to the man's level as he secured the cuffs. "Why did you try to take that little girl?" The suspect didn't answer right away. His chest heaved as he stared up at Harris, but there was no pride in his eyes, just fear and a sense of helplessness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice shaky. I don't want to die," he muttered, his voice cracking with panic. They made me do it. I had no choice." Harris' brows furrowed in confusion. "Who made you do it?" He pressed, his grip tightening on the man's shoulder, urging him to explain. But before the man could say anything more, the sound of sirens grew louder, signaling that more officers had arrived on the scene. A few moments later, 2 squad cars pulled up, and several officers rushed out, taking control of the situation. Harris stepped back, allowing them to take over, but his mind was already racing. Something wasn't right. The man had been desperate, but it wasn't just an ordinary kidnapping attempt. There was a larger picture here, something deeper, something that made the man act without hesitation. One of the officers approached Harris, nodding at the suspect who was now being shoved into the back of a squad car. "You okay?" the officer asked, concern in his voice. "I'm fine," Harris said, though his mind was far from settled. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. The man's cryptic words, "They made me do it," echoed in his mind, and Harris couldn't ignore the suspicion growing in his gut. Harris glanced over at Max, who stood by, his eyes still focused on the suspect. The dog's loyalty was unwavering, but even Max seemed to sense that this wasn't over. Harris reached down to give Max a quick pat on the head, his fingers running through the dog's fur. "Good boy, Max," he said quietly, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He could feel the weight of the situation settling in. There was more to this story than just a man trying to kidnap a child. As the suspect was driven away in the squad car, Harris stood there, his mind racing with questions. Who had coerced the man into trying to take Emily? Why had he been so desperate? And most importantly, what was the real story behind the kidnapping attempt? One thing was for certain, the man had failed, but whatever forces were behind him had not given up. Harris knew he was only at the beginning of unraveling something far darker, and he wasn't about to let it go. The sound of the sirens slowly faded as the last of the police units left the scene, the suspect now in custody and en route to the station. But Officer Harris couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. There was something about the entire situation that didn't sit right. Max sat beside him in the front of his patrol car, the dog's eyes still sharp, ever watchful. Harris rubbed his forehead, thinking back to the man's words. "They made me do it." His stomach twisted. What did he mean by that? Who was he talking about? After a few moments, Harris put the car in gear and pulled away from the scene, heading toward the station. He needed answers, and he wasn't about to wait for the standard paperwork or interrogations to give him the full picture. As he drove, his mind wandered back to the park. The way the man had moved with purpose, the look in his eyes when he grabbed Emily, it was all too calculated. This wasn't the behavior of someone with a random agenda. There was a deeper motive. He reached the station a short time later and parked in the back lot. The officers who had taken the man into custody were already unloading him from the squad car. Harris stepped out of his vehicle, his hand instinctively resting on his holster as he approached. The suspect had been taken into an interrogation room, but Harris was eager to get there before anyone else. Inside the station, a detective by the name of Reynolds was already standing by the door to the interrogation room. "Harris," Reynolds said with a nod, his expression serious. "We were just about to start asking him some questions. You want in?" Harris didn't waste any time. "Yeah, I need to know what the hell's going on. Now." Reynolds led him into the room where the suspect was sitting, looking disheveled and exhausted. His face was still bruised from the crash, and his hands were bound tightly to the chair. The suspect's eyes flicked up at Harris as he entered, but there was no defiance left. The man seemed defeated, his earlier bravado evaporated. "Who made you do it?" Harris asked again, his voice hard. He stood in front of the man, trying to read his expression. The suspect looked up at Harris, his gaze filled with fear. "I didn't want to hurt her," he whispered, his voice shaking. "But they said if I didn't take her, they'd hurt my family. They'd kill them." Harris' heart dropped. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was something far more sinister. "Who are they? Who's behind this?" he pressed. The man swallowed hard, clearly wrestling with himself, as if weighing the consequences of speaking the truth. Finally, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know their names. I don't know who they are, but they're connected to something bigger. They've been watching me for months, following me, controlling me. If I didn't do what they told me, they said they'd hurt my wife and son. I couldn't let that happen." The air in the room seemed to thicken as Harris processed the man's words. His mind raced. The man wasn't just a kidnapper. He was being forced to carry out these terrible acts. "Who are they?" Harris demanded again, this time his voice cold with frustration, but the man only shook his head. "I don't know. I swear, I don't know who they are." The man pleaded. "They always covered their faces, always communicated through messages. They said they'd hurt my family if I ever went to the cops. I had no choice. I thought I could get away, but you stopped me before I could. I don't know what to do anymore." Harris' eyes narrowed, processing everything. This wasn't just a random kidnapping. Some organization, was orchestrating this from the shadows, using fear and manipulation to control others into committing terrible acts. Max, who had followed Harris into the station and was sitting quietly at his feet, suddenly let out a low growl. Harris looked down at the dog, sensing that the man's fear had triggered something in him. Max wasn't just reacting to the situation, it was as if he knew the threat was far from over. "Take him to holding," Harris said, turning to Reynolds, his voice tense. "We need to put out an APB, search for whoever's behind this. This is bigger than one man." As the officers escorted the suspect out of the room, Harris stood there, staring after them, his mind spinning. The answers he'd just heard only opened up more questions. Who was behind this shadowy organization? What were they planning next? And how far would they go to get what they wanted? Harris knew one thing for sure. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. Harris stood in the dimly lit interrogation room, the weight of the suspect's words still heavy in the air. His mind raced as he processed the information. The idea that an entire organization was pulling strings from the shadows was enough to make anyone uneasy. The man wasn't just a criminal. He was a pawn, a terrified individual caught in something far beyond his control. As Harris walked out of the room, he felt the sharp gaze of Detective Reynolds following him. The look in Reynolds' eyes mirrored his own growing concern. "We need to act fast," Harris said, his voice low but determined. "If what this guy's saying is true, we're dealing with something much bigger than just a random kidnapping attempt. This could be part of a pattern, a much larger operation. Reynolds nodded, already pulling out his phone. I'll get the team on it. We'll put out an APB on the suspect's family, see if there's any connection to the larger picture. But if there's a group controlling people like him, we need to be prepared for anything. Check every angle, Harris said. Look into anyone who's gone missing recently, anyone who could have been coerced into doing something they didn't want to do. I have a feeling we're only scratching the surface. Max, still by Harris's side, let out a soft growl. His ears perked. It seemed like the dog had picked up on the rising tension, and his presence was a steady reminder of the importance of staying vigilant. Harris reached down to pat Max's head. The dog's intuition had never been wrong before. As the investigation progressed, Harris and Reynolds dug deeper into the suspect's life. They discovered a chilling trail of similar cases, all of which involved people coerced into committing violent acts under the threat of harm to their families. There was a pattern, and it all seemed to trace back to one organization, a shadowy group that operated in the darkest corners of the city. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the group's influence extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. They used fear, manipulation, and blackmail to control their victims, forcing them into committing heinous crimes with the promise of safety for their loved ones. But the true scope of their operation remained hidden, like a vast web that stretched into the heart of the city, connecting unknown players with sinister intentions. Hours later, Harris sat at his desk, staring at the piles of files in front of him. His mind was spinning with all the information they had uncovered. Despite the man's arrest, the true mastermind behind everything was still out there, pulling the strings. Harris rubbed his temples. They had so many leads, so many unanswered questions, but not enough evidence to make a decisive move. The sense of urgency gnawed at him. If they didn't act quickly, this organization could strike again, forcing more innocent people into their web of control. Max, sensing Harris's frustration, nudged his hand with his nose, as if reminding him that they couldn't give up. Harris smiled weakly, grateful for the dog's unwavering support. "Thanks, buddy," Harris muttered, running his fingers through Max's fur. "We're not done yet. We're just getting started." A sudden knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Reynolds stepped inside, holding a folder in his hands. His face was grim, and Harris instantly knew it wasn't good news. "We've got something," Reynolds said, dropping the folder onto Harris's desk. "The suspect's family. They're safe. But we found something even more disturbing. A list of names. People who've been targeted by this group. And we think we've identified the ringleader." Harris' heart skipped a beat. "Who?" Reynolds hesitated, then opened the folder, revealing a series of names and photographs. One name stood out above the rest: Victor Kane. Harris' blood ran cold. Kane was a name that carried weight in the city, an elusive, powerful figure known for running illicit businesses, but with no solid proof to ever tie him to a crime. The idea that he was the leader of a criminal syndicate pulling the strings from the shadows made sense in a twisted, terrifying way. Harris' mind raced. Victor Kane had managed to operate in the shadows for years, his influence spreading like a virus through the city's underworld. And now, it seemed like he was finally ready to reveal his hand. "This ends now," Harris said, a determined fire igniting in his chest. He looked down at Max, who was already staring at him, ready for whatever came next. The final chapter of this nightmare was about to unfold. They had a lead, they had a name, and they were going after Kane. With a deep breath, Harris stood up, his decision made. The hunt was on.